June 18, 1815, Waterloo, Belgium. 200 miles away in London, Nathan Meyer Rothschild stands on the floor of the London Stock Exchange. He knows something no one else in England knows yet. He knows who won the battle. His private courier network, faster than any government dispatch, has already delivered the news. Napoleon has been defeated. Wellington has won. Britain is safe. But Nathan Rothschild does not celebrate. He begins selling British government bonds, massive quantities. The other traders watch in horror. If Rothschild is selling, something must be terribly wrong. They assume Napoleon has won, that Britain faces invasion and ruin, that their bonds are worthless. Panic spreads, everyone sells. The price of British government bonds collapses. Then when prices hit rock bottom, Rothschild reverses course. He buys everything. Every bond he had sold and thousands more. Within hours, the official news arrives by slower channels. Britain has won the war. Bond prices soar. Nathan Rothschild has just made the equivalent of hundreds of millions, possibly billions in modern currency, in a single day by controlling information and understanding one fundamental truth. War creates the most profitable trading conditions in history. But Rothschild did not just profit from the war. He financed it. The Rothschild banking family had loaned money to Britain to fight Napoleon. They had also loaned money to various German states allied with Britain. And through their Frankfurt branch, they maintained relationships with French financial networks. When nations go to war, they need money immediately, before they can collect taxes, before they can confiscate property, before they can do anything except fight. They borrow. And whoever loans that money profits, regardless of which side wins. This is not ancient history relegated to dusty textbooks. This is the blueprint for the modern world. Every major war for the past 250 years has been financed by international banking houses using the same mechanisms pioneered at Waterloo. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Wars cost trillions of dollars. Governments do not have trillions sitting in vaults. They borrow it. And whoever loans it makes a profit that compounds across generations. Right now, in 2025, the United States has $36 trillion in national debt. Approximately $8 trillion of that was added since 2001 to finance the war on terror. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan officially cost $2.3 trillion in direct spending. When you include long-term veteran care and interest on borrowed money, the real cost exceeds $8 trillion. The wars ended years ago. The troops came home, but the debt remains. And every single year, American taxpayers send over $1 trillion to bondholders as interest payments. Much of that interest is payment on money borrowed decades ago to fight wars that most voters were not alive to see. This is the system. Wars are financed with debt. The debt never gets fully repaid. It compounds, it rolls over. It becomes permanent. And the people who loan the money profit forever. The question is not whether this will happen again. The question is, how much will the next war cost, who will finance it, and how long will your children be paying interest on it? This is the complete history of how international bankers financed every side of every major war since 1750. The specific mechanisms they used to profit, how war debt built the modern central banking system, and why the structure of the system makes wars financially profitable for those who never set foot on a battlefield. Meyer Amschel Rothschild was born in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt, Germany in 1744. He began his career as a dealer in rare coins and precious metals. But Rothschild understood something that would transform his family into the wealthiest dynasty in Europe. He understood that governments at war need money faster than they can raise it through taxation, and whoever can provide that money immediately controls the government. In the 1790s, Europe was convulsed by the French Revolution and the wars that followed. The old monarchies were fighting for survival. Armies needed to be paid. Supplies needed to be purchased. And gold, the universal currency of the era, needed to be moved across hostile borders. Rothschild positioned himself as the indispensable intermediary. He would loan money to princes and kings. He would arrange for the transfer of gold and silver across war zones. He would take government bonds as collateral, bonds that promised future payment with interest. But Rothschild's true genius was not individual transactions, it was creating a network. He had 5 sons and he deployed them like pieces on a chessboard. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt. Salomon went to Vienna. Nathan went to London. Karl went to Naples. James went to Paris. 5 brothers in 5 European capitals, all operating as a single coordinated entity. They could move money across borders faster than any army. They could communicate across battle lines faster than any government. And critically, they could loan to multiple sides of the same conflict. The Napoleonic Wars, which raged from 1803 to 1815, cost the belligerent nations approximately $7 billion in period currency. Britain alone borrowed the equivalent of $180 billion in today's money to fight Napoleon. Where did that money come from? Banking houses, primarily the Rothschilds, Barings, and a handful of other merchant banks. The mechanism was straightforward but transformative. Britain issued government bonds promising to pay 5% annual interest. Banks purchased those bonds, providing the government with immediate cash. The government used that cash to pay soldiers, purchase weapons, and feed armies. The war eventually ended in 1815 with Napoleon's defeat. But the bonds did not end. They remained outstanding, paying 5% interest year after year after year. By 1855, 40 years after Waterloo, Britain had paid more in cumulative interest than the original principal borrowed. But the debt itself had not been repaid. It simply rolled over. New bonds were issued to pay off maturing old bonds. The system was designed not for repayment, but for perpetual interest extraction. This is the foundational mechanism of war finance. The war is temporary, often lasting only a few years. The debt is permanent, lasting generations. The banker loans money once and collects interest indefinitely. When Nathan Rothschild died in 1836, his personal wealth was estimated at £5 million. Adjusted for economic power and inflation, that represents approximately $400 billion in today's terms. He was the richest private individual on earth, and that wealth came overwhelmingly from government bonds issued during the Napoleonic Wars. But the Rothschilds did not merely profit passively. They shaped policy. When France needed loans to pay war reparations in 1825, the Rothschild Bank arranged it, but demanded policy concessions regarding tariffs and trade. When Belgium broke away from the Netherlands in 1830 and needed international recognition and financing, the Rothschilds provided loans in exchange for influence over Belgian fiscal policy for decades. This established a pattern that persists today. Whoever controls the money controls the government. Elected officials come and go. Bankers who hold sovereign debt remain. The Napoleonic Wars established the blueprint. But it was World War I that scaled the system to industrial proportions and revealed its true power. When war erupted in August 1914, every combatant faced an immediate crisis. Modern industrial warfare was obscenely expensive. Germany's gold reserves totaled about $250 million. France held $680 million. Britain had $170 million. But the war would consume tens of billions per year. No nation could fight for more than a few months on reserves alone. Every government turned to the same solution: borrow, issue bonds, sell them to anyone willing to buy. But European banks, even the Rothschilds, could not finance a conflict of this scale. There was only one place with sufficient capital: the United States. And there was one bank with the capacity to arrange loans measured in billions: J.P. Morgan and Company. By 1915, Britain and France were purchasing enormous quantities of war materials from American manufacturers. Shells, rifles, explosives, uniforms, food, medical supplies, but they were running out of money to pay for them. They needed loans. The United States was officially neutral. President Woodrow Wilson had proclaimed American neutrality. But American banks were not government entities. They were free to loan to belligerent nations as private business transactions. J.P. Morgan and Company became the official purchasing agent for the British and French governments in the United States. This was an extraordinary arrangement. Every single purchase Britain and France made in America went through Morgan's bank. And Morgan arranged the financing for those purchases. In January 1915, Morgan arranged a $12 million loan to France. In August 1915, Morgan arranged a $500 million loan jointly to Britain and France, the largest loan in history to that point. In total, between 1915 and 1917, before America entered the war, J.P. Morgan arranged over $3 billion in loans to the Allied powers. In today's money, that exceeds $90 billion. The terms were lucrative. The loans carried 5% annual interest. But Morgan also received commissions on every transaction, every purchase, every shipment. Estimated total commissions exceeded $30 million, roughly $900 million in modern currency. And Morgan's bank purchased portions of the bonds themselves, earning interest as a bondholder. But here's the critical inflection point. Morgan did not just arrange loans. Morgan became invested in the outcome. If Britain and France lost the war, they would be unable to repay. Morgan would lose billions. The bank, and by extension, many of America's wealthiest families who were invested alongside Morgan, had a direct financial interest in ensuring the Allies won. And in April 1917, The United States declared war on Germany and entered the conflict on the side of Britain and France. Historians debate the reasons. German unrestricted submarine warfare. The Zimmermann telegram promising Mexico-American territory if it allied with Germany. Ideological affinity for democratic Britain and France over autocratic Germany. All valid factors. But there is another factor rarely discussed in high school textbooks. If Britain and France lost, American banks would lose billions in defaulted loans. American entry into the war guaranteed that would not happen. When America entered, it brought industrial capacity, financial resources, and fresh troops that turned the tide decisively. The Allies won, and American banks were repaid. When the war ended in November 1918, the debt remained. Britain owed the United States $4.7 billion. France owed $4 billion. Italy owed $2 billion. Russia, which had collapsed into communist revolution in 1917, owed $192 million but never repaid. Total Allied debt to the United States exceeded $11 billion, roughly $200 billion in modern terms. These debts were restructured multiple times but never forgiven. Britain made its final World War I debt payment to the United States in 2015, 97 years after the armistice. France defaulted in 1932 during the Great Depression and never fully repaid. But the banks that arranged the loans had already profited enormously from commissions and interest paid during and immediately after the war. And the existence of these debts created a financial architecture that would define the 20th century. Britain owed America. Germany owed Britain and France in reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. The entire European economy became an interconnected web of unpayable debts. And when the system collapsed in the 1930s, it contributed directly to the Great Depression and created the economic desperation that brought Hitler to power in Germany. War debt from 1914 helped cause the Second World War 20 years later. World War II was fought on a scale that dwarfed anything in human history. And it was financed using mechanisms that would permanently transform the global financial system. By 1939, governments had learned from World War I. They could not rely on private banks alone to finance total war. They needed central banks that could create money on demand. In the United States, the Federal Reserve, created in 1913 partially to facilitate government borrowing, became the engine of war finance. The mechanism was elegantly simple and economically catastrophic in the long term. The U.S. government issued Treasury bonds. The Federal Reserve purchased those bonds not with existing money, but by creating new money. This is called monetizing the debt. The government received cash immediately to pay for tanks, ships, aircraft, and soldiers. The Federal Reserve held the bonds, which paid interest. And the money supply expanded dramatically. Between 1940 and 1945, federal debt exploded from $43 billion to $259 billion, a six-fold increase in 5 years. Much of that debt was purchased by the Federal Reserve, creating new dollars. Britain did the same through the Bank of England. Between 1939 and 1945, British government debt increased from £7 billion to £24 billion, a 3.4 times increase. Germany financed the Wehrmacht through the Reichsbank, which printed Reichsmarks by the trainload. By 1945, Germany's money supply had increased eightfold from pre-war levels, creating hyperinflation that destroyed what remained of the German economy after the bombs stopped falling. Every major combatant printed money to finance war. And when the war ended, the debt remained. But this time it was owed not primarily to private bankers, but to central banks, quasi-governmental institutions that are technically independent but operate in coordination with the state. This created a new permanent architecture. Government debt held by central banks that create money to purchase it. The debt never needs to be repaid in the traditional sense because the central bank can always create more money to buy more bonds. But this creates inflation, which erodes the real value of existing debt over time. This is the system that governs the developed world today. Governments borrow to finance wars, crises, or simply excess spending. Central banks purchase the debt by creating money. The debt nominally remains on the books, but inflates away in real terms over decades. And the population pays through the invisible tax of inflation, which reduces purchasing power while the government technically repays its obligations in depreciated currency. After World War II, total global government debt exceeded $1 trillion. Roughly $16 trillion in today's money. The largest debtor was the United States at $259 billion. But World War II created something even more significant than debt. It created a new international monetary system designed to ensure that future debts would be repayable in dollars, and that dollars would flow from the rest of the world to the United States in perpetuity. In July 1944, with the war still raging, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their purpose was to design the post-war international financial system. The system they created has governed global finance for 80 years and ensured that the dollar, and by extension American financial power, would dominate the world. The Bretton Woods Agreement established the US dollar as the world reserve currency. Every other major currency would be pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates, and the dollar itself would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. This arrangement meant several things. First, the dollar was as good as gold, backed by the largest gold reserve in history held at Fort Knox and the New York Federal Reserve. Second, every nation needed dollars to engage in international trade. Third, and most critically for our story, all the war debts owed by Britain, France, China, and other Allied nations were denominated in dollars. To repay these debts, countries needed to earn dollars by exporting goods to the United States or by borrowing more dollars. This created permanent structural demand for the currency. The United States had won the war militarily, but Bretton Woods ensured America won financially and permanently. The Bretton Woods Conference also created two institutions that would become mechanisms for extending dollar-denominated loans globally: the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Both were headquartered in Washington. Both operated primarily in dollars, and both had the mandate to loan money to countries facing financial difficulties. In practice, this meant that countries unable to repay war debts or facing post-war reconstruction costs would borrow from the IMF and World Bank, creating new dollar-denominated debts. If they could not repay, they would restructure and borrow more. The system was designed to create a permanent flow of debt service payments from borrowers to lenders, with the United States and its banks at the center. This is how war debt built the modern international financial system. A system where debt is permanent, denominated in dollars, and ensures that wealth flows from debtor nations to creditor nations and the banks that intermediate those flows. Since 1945, every major American war has followed the same pattern established over 2 centuries. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, cost $450 billion in today's dollars. It was financed entirely with debt. U.S. federal debt increased from $257 billion in 1950 to $266 billion in 1953. The war ended. The debt remained and compounded. The Vietnam War, 1965 to 1973, cost $1 trillion in today's dollars. U.S. federal debt increased from $317 billion in 1965 to $458 billion in 1973. The war ended. The debt remained. And the inflation caused by financing the war through monetary expansion contributed to the economic crisis of the 1970s. The Gulf War of 1990 to 1991 cost $12 billion, but was partially financed by allies. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other Gulf states contributed $54 billion. The United States borrowed only $48 billion. This was unusual. Most wars are fully debt-financed. But the most instructive case is the War on Terror. From 2001 to 2021, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost the United States approximately $2.3 trillion in direct military spending. When you include long-term costs, veteran healthcare, disability payments, and most importantly interest on money borrowed to fight the wars, the total cost exceeds $8 trillion. How was this financed? Entirely with debt. U.S. federal debt increased from $5.8 trillion in 2001 to $28.4 trillion in 2021. Not all of that increase was war spending. Some was financial crisis response, some was pandemic relief, some was routine deficit spending. But approximately $8 trillion is attributable to the War on Terror and its long-term consequences. In 2025, the United States is still paying interest on money borrowed to finance operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. The wars officially ended years ago. The troops have returned home, but the debt remains. At current interest rates, the U.S. pays approximately $320 billion per year in interest, specifically on the $8 trillion borrowed for the War on Terror. Think about that. Every year, $320 billion, more than the entire GDP of many countries, flows from American taxpayers to bondholders as payment for wars that ended years ago. Over 30 years, that totals $9.6 trillion in interest payments on $8 trillion in principal. The wars cost $8 trillion to fight. They will cost nearly $10 trillion more in interest over the following decades. And the principal will never be repaid. It will simply be refinanced when bonds mature. New bonds will be issued to pay off old bonds. The debt rolls over indefinitely and the interest payments continue forever. This is the system in its purest form. Wars are financed with debt. The debt is never repaid. It compounds and rolls over, and wealth flows from taxpayers to bondholders in perpetuity. The question is not whether this will happen again. The question is when and how expensive will the next war be? Who specifically has profited from 2.5 centuries of war financing? These are not abstract institutions. These are families and firms whose wealth was built on lending money to governments at war. The Rothschild family fortune, built primarily on financing the Napoleonic Wars, persists today. The dynasty split into French and British branches after World War I. Rothschild & Co., the French branch, manages assets exceeding $100 billion as of 2024. The British branch, operating through various entities, controls assets estimated at $60 billion. Combined, the family network commands approximately $160 billion in assets, traceable directly to a banking empire built on war finance 2 centuries ago. The Morgan family fortune, built on World War I financing, evolved into J.P. Morgan Chase, now the largest bank in the United States with $3.9 trillion in assets. While no individual Morgan family member controls the institution today, the bank that J.P. Morgan built by financing the Allies dominates American finance. The Warburg family, which played critical roles in financing both world wars through positions in banking in Germany and the United States, built wealth estimated at over $10 billion, dispersed among various descendants and institutions. Beyond families, the institutions created to finance wars became permanent fixtures of global finance. The Federal Reserve, created in 1913 in part to facilitate government borrowing for potential war, now holds $4.8 trillion in Treasury securities, much of it from financing wars, financial crises, and pandemic responses. The interest on those bonds, paid by taxpayers, flows to the Federal Reserve, which remits most profits to the Treasury, but retains enough to fund operations and pay dividends to member banks. Investment banks that underwrite government bonds profit from every war. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Citigroup, J.P. Morgan Chase. These firms earn fees on every Treasury auction. When the government needs to borrow $2 trillion to finance a war, these banks arrange the bond sales and collect 0.5 to 1% in fees. That translates to $10 to $20 billion in fees for arranging a $2 trillion war loan. Defense contractors profit from wars directly by building weapons and equipment. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon. But banks profit indirectly by financing the debt that pays the contractors. It is a circular system. The government borrows from banks to pay contractors. Contractors deposit profits in banks. Banks hold government bonds earning interest. Everyone profits except the taxpayer, who pays interest indefinitely. Let me show you the mathematics of how war debt compounds over generations. In 2001, U.S. federal debt was $5.8 trillion. The Iraq War began in 2003. Between 2003 and 2011, the Iraq War cost approximately $2 trillion. This was financed entirely with borrowed money. The government issued treasury bonds. Banks, foreign governments, pension funds, and individuals purchased them. The government received cash immediately and used it to fund military operations. Those bonds pay interest. The average interest rate on treasury bonds during this period was approximately 3%. 3% annual interest on $2 trillion equals $60 billion per year in interest payments. The Iraq War officially ended in 2011, though U.S. forces remained in advisory roles. But the interest payments did not end. From 2011 to 2024, 13 years, the government paid approximately $60 billion per year in interest. That totals $780 billion in interest paid on a $2 trillion war. But the principal, the original $2 trillion, was never repaid. The debt is still outstanding. When bonds mature, the government issues new bonds to pay off the old ones. This is called rolling over the debt. The principal never disappears, it simply gets refinanced indefinitely. By 2024, the $2 trillion borrowed for the Iraq War has generated over $1 trillion in cumulative interest payments since the war began. And it will continue generating interest payments for decades. Over 30 years, the typical maturity horizon for long-term analysis. The government will pay $1.8 trillion in interest on $2 trillion in principal. Total cost, $3.8 trillion for a $2 trillion war. But even that understates the reality because interest rates fluctuate. If rates rise, the interest burden increases. And the compounding effect means that interest paid in year 20 is higher than interest paid in year 10 because the cumulative debt load has grown. Ultimately, the Iraq War, which cost $2 trillion to fight, will cost an additional $5 trillion or more in interest over 50 years when you account for compounding and refinancing. And who receives that $5 trillion in interest payments over half a century? Bondholders, banks, foreign governments like China and Japan, pension funds, wealthy individuals. They loaned money once in 2003 to finance the war. They collect interest forever. This is the system. War debt never gets repaid. It gets refinanced indefinitely, and the interest compounds in perpetuity. This system is not theoretical or historical. It is operating right now, today, as you read this. U.S. federal debt in December 2024 stands at $36.2 trillion. Interest payments in 2024 total $1.13 trillion. That is the third largest federal expenditure, exceeded only by Social Security and Medicare. It is larger than the defense budget. Of that $36.2 trillion, approximately $15 trillion has been added since 2001 for wars, financial crisis bailouts, pandemic relief, and routine deficit spending. All financed with debt. None repaid. All generating permanent interest obligations. Who holds this debt? Foreign governments hold $8.1 trillion. China holds $795 billion. Japan holds $1.1 trillion. The Federal Reserve holds $4.8 trillion. Domestic investors, including banks, pension funds, and individuals, hold the remainder. Every year, the U.S. government transfers $1.13 trillion to these bondholders. Of that total, approximately $320 billion is interest specifically on debt borrowed for the war on terror. That money flows from American taxpayers to bondholders globally, and it will continue flowing for decades. And the debt continues growing. The federal deficit in 2024 is projected at $1.9 trillion. The government is borrowing $1.9 trillion this year alone, adding to the permanent debt stock that generates permanent interest payments. This is the system perfected over 250 years. Governments borrow to finance wars. The debt never gets repaid, it compounds and rolls over. And wealth flows from taxpayers to bondholders indefinitely. But here's the critical insight that connects everything. This system creates incentives for conflict, not consciously, not through a cabal of bankers plotting wars in smoke-filled rooms, but structurally. Wars create enormous immediate borrowing needs. Borrowing creates profits for banks that arrange the loans. Those banks have lobbyists. Defense contractors have lobbyists. The financial system that profits from war debt has influence over policy. I am not claiming that wars happen solely because banks profit from them. Wars have complex causes rooted in geopolitics, ideology, competition for resources, and historical grievances. But the financial architecture built over 2.5 centuries of war financing creates powerful interests that benefit from conflict rather than peace. And those interests, whether consciously or not, influence the decisions that lead to war. President Eisenhower warned in 1961 about the military-industrial complex, the alliance between defense contractors and the Pentagon that creates pressure for military spending. But the complex is larger than he described. It includes the financial system that profits from the debt used to pay defense contractors. Lockheed Martin profits from building aircraft. J.P. Morgan Chase profits from arranging the bonds that finance the purchase. Both benefit from war. Both lobby accordingly. The pattern will repeat because the system remains in place. If the United States enters a major conflict with China over Taiwan, the estimated cost ranges from $2 trillion to $5 trillion depending on duration and intensity. The government does not have $2 trillion in reserves. It will borrow. Investment banks will arrange bond auctions. The Federal Reserve will purchase bonds by creating money. The debt will be added to the national total, which will exceed $40 trillion. Annual interest payments will rise above $1.5 trillion. And 30 years after that war ends, taxpayers will still be paying interest on money borrowed to fight it. If a major war erupts in the Middle East involving Iran, estimated cost ranges from $1 trillion to $3 trillion. The mechanism will be identical. Borrow, fight, never fully repay, and pay interest forever. If conflict expands in Eastern Europe beyond Ukraine, estimated costs could reach $500 billion to $2 trillion. Same pattern. Every future war will follow this template because this is the system. Wars are too expensive to finance from existing revenue. Governments borrow. The debt becomes permanent. Interest compounds. And wealth transfers from taxpayers to bondholders across generations. So what does this mean for you living inside the system today? First, understand that national debt is not an abstraction. It is money borrowed that creates obligations. And you are the one fulfilling those obligations through taxes and inflation. Every dollar of the $36.2 trillion in federal debt represents a claim on future tax revenue. Your taxes, your children's taxes, your grandchildren's taxes, all paying interest on money borrowed for wars, crises, and spending that happened before they were born. Second, recognize that inflation is a method of war financing. When central banks create money to purchase government bonds, they expand the money supply. More money chasing the same quantity of goods and services means rising prices. Inflation is how governments partially default on debt without officially defaulting. They borrow $1 trillion, then repay it in currency that has lost value. The nominal debt is repaid. The real value is not, and you pay the difference through reduced purchasing power. Third, understand that this system benefits asset holders at the expense of wage earners. If you earn a salary and own no assets, you pay taxes that fund interest payments to bondholders. If you own government bonds or other financial assets, you receive interest funded by someone else's taxes. The system is designed to transfer wealth from labor to capital. If you want to position yourself on the receiving end rather than the paying end, own assets, treasury bonds, real estate, equities. At least capture some of the wealth being transferred. Fourth, recognize that government debt crowds out productive investment. Every dollar the government borrows is a dollar that could have been invested in private businesses that create jobs, innovation, and economic growth. War debt, which produces no economic return, diverts capital from productive uses. The opportunity cost of $36.2 trillion in national debt is the businesses, technologies, and innovations that were never funded because capital went to finance wars instead. The system was built deliberately by the most sophisticated financial minds across centuries. Meyer Amschel Rothschild perfected war financing during the Napoleonic Wars. J.P. Morgan scaled it to industrial proportions during World War I. Federal Reserve institutionalized it by becoming the permanent purchaser of government debt. And the Bretton Woods system globalized it by making the dollar the reserve currency and denominating international debts in dollars. Each iteration expanded the system and made it more entrenched. The system persists because it benefits those with power. Banks profit from underwriting fees and interest. Bondholders collect returns funded by taxpayers. Defense contractors receive government spending. Politicians can finance wars without immediately raising taxes, pushing costs onto future generations who cannot vote against them. You live inside this system. You pay for it through taxes and inflation. And unless you understand how it operates, you will remain on the paying side while others collect interest on debt borrowed decades ago to fight wars you never voted for. The international bankers who financed both sides of the world wars did not do so from patriotism or ideology. They did it for profit. And the system they constructed, where wars create permanent debt that generates permanent interest payments, has transferred wealth from taxpayers to financial elites for 250 years. The next war will follow the same pattern. The government will borrow trillions. Banks will arrange it. The war will end. The debt will remain. And your children will pay interest on it for their entire lives while the institutions that arrange the loans profit indefinitely. This is not conspiracy. This is documented financial history showing exactly how the modern debt system was built on war financing and how it continues operating today. Understanding the system is the first step toward protecting yourself from it.